John was and will always be my guiding star. Naturally, the pain from his slow decline over the past 5 years due to Alzheimer's disease has been incredibly painful for my family. Besides the pure agony of it all, and in line with the metaphor, the dimming of his light has often left me feeling desperately lost and without direction. With time, however, I found meaning through trying to live up to him and who he was. Holding on to his memory has allowed me to channel that crushing pain into something meaningful. It represents what an amazing person John was. If he wasn't worth remembering, losing him wouldn't hurt nearly as much. A few weeks ago, John passed away. His death was the first and last mercy of his illness, and while I feel some bittersweet relief that his fragmented mind can finally rest, I also feel uneasy. After his passing, I discovered a set of papers under the mattress of his hospice bed, a sort of journal or maybe logbook. Even if you ignore the actual content of these papers, their existence is quite baffling. First of all, my father could not speak a meaningful sentence for at least 6 months before he passed away, let alone write one. And yet, I find myself holding a series of clearly written journal entries in his handwriting with his very distinctive narrative voice. At first, I thought these papers were old, and that maybe another family member had left them behind during a visit. But why would they hide them under his mattress? Upon further inspection, I found evidence that these papers were written recently. We moved John into this hospice facility 6 months ago, and one unique thing about this place is how they provide meals for their patients. Every morning at sunrise, the aides distribute menus detailing what will be available to eat throughout the day. I always found this a bit odd. People near death aren't known for having a big appetite or much interest in meals, but ultimately it was wholesome and humanizing. John had written his logbook in delicate blue ink on the back of these menus. Although strange, I think I could understand finding incoherent scribbles on the back of loose paper menus hidden under a mattress as something from a rapidly deteriorating mind. But what I have next to my laptop are not incoherent scribbles. I am writing this to preserve the transcripts of John's deathbed logbook. In doing so, I find myself thinking about the point and possible dangers of doing this. Morally, I think sharing what he recorded in the brief lucid moments before his death may be selfish, but I am finding my morals are being tested by my continuing, desperate search for guidance, a replacement guiding star to fill the void left by the loss of a great man. I realize my actions here may only speed up some looming disaster. For these logs to make sense, I need to describe who John was. Socially, he was soft-spoken, despite having a great sense of humor, which usually goes hand in hand with being outgoing. Throughout my childhood, however, his introversion turned into extreme reclusiveness. I try not to blame him for this, as his solitary nature was a result of his devotion to his work and his singular hobby. He paid the bills with a science background and found meaning through art. More specifically, he was a cellular biologist and an amateur oil painter. I think he found fulfillment through the combination of biology and art. He once told me he felt that pursuing both fields with equal passion would help him find their common end point, the place where intellectualism and faith eventually merge and become one. I think he believed that was enlightenment, even if he never explicitly said so. In his job, he was a researcher at the cutting edge of what he called cellular topography. Essentially, he was studying the structure of human cells at a very tiny level. He would say, looking at a cell under a normal microscope is like looking at a map of America, a top-down, big-picture view. I'm looking at the cell like I'm one person walking through a small town in Kansas. I'm recording and documenting the peaks, the valleys, the ponds. I'm mapping the tiny landmarks that characterize the endless complexity of life. I will not pretend to fully understand that statement, even though I also pursued a career in biology. I just rarely observe cells at a small town in Kansas level as a hospital pediatrician. As his life went on, it was increasing dementia that took him away from his career. He retired at the start of both the pandemic and my medical training. I missed the early stages of it all, but I heard from my sister that he cared about his retirement until he didn't remember what his career was anymore. She compared it to sitting outside in the fading heat of the summer sun as the day turns to night. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he was losing the warmth of his ambitions until he couldn't remember the feeling of warmth at all in the darkness of this new night. His interest and later disinterest in painting followed the same path. Normally, if he was home and awake, he would be in his studio, working on a new piece. He had a variety of influences, but he always wanted to combine the objective beauty of Claude Monet and the abstract nature of Picasso. He was always one for merging opposites, until his disease took that away too. Because of his blending of styles, his works were not popular with the masses. They were a bit too chaotic and confusing, I think. Not that he tried to sell them or show them off. The only one I can remember clearly depicted the oak tree in our backyard, with realistic human blood vessels visible under the bark. When I was 8, this scared me a lot, and I couldn't tell you what point he was trying to make, nor did he ever explain his point, not even to ease my fear of trees. But enough introduction. Here is his first entry, or what I think is his first entry. I say this because although the entries are dated, none of the dates are from the last 6 months. In fact, they span over 20 years. One evening, about a week after he died, I called his case manager at the hospice to ask if she could help determine when each menu was distributed. She was understandably confused. Looking back, I realize how odd this question was after John died. I reluctantly shared my discovery of the logbook, for which she also had no explanation. What she could tell me is that none of his care team ever saw him writing anything, and they don't like having loose pens around their memory unit because they could be dangerous for patients. John journaled throughout his life, though he was very private about his writing, and seemingly got rid of his journals once they were full. I don't remember exactly when he started journaling, but I have vivid memories of being shooed away when I found him writing in his notebooks. As a teenager, I resented him for this, but in the end, I've tried to let it go. As a small note, he went out of his way to carefully draw some tables and figures, showing that some part of his scientific method survived the wildfire that was his dementia, only to reappear just before his death. I will scan and upload those pictures as well. I will have reviewed all the entries by the time I post this. A lot has happened in the weeks since he's passed, and I plan on adding comments to help explain the entries. It may take me some time. Before each of his entries, John included an image, which you can find at this link, https:/imgur.com/rb2vbhp. This image was perfectly copied between entries, and I mean perfect, they were all identical. John's skilled hand and analytical mind seemed to reawaken during his time in hospice, even though when I visited him, I had to help him with dressing and brushing his teeth. I want to let you know that this image is a significant part of everything I found in his logbook. It is a divine and horrible cornerstone, the main part, the cursed key to understanding his writings. As much as I want to stress its importance, I can't explain why it is so important at the moment. All I can say is that I believe John found his common endpoint, and it might cost us dearly. Entry 1, dated April 2004. First translocation. The morning of the first translocation felt like any other day. I woke up around 9 a.m. Lucy was already out of bed, probably for a while. Peter and Lily had become quite a handful over the last few years, and Lucy needed help giving Lily her medications. I stood at the top of our banister, looking over the beautiful chaos of raising young children. Legos were scattered everywhere. Stains of unknown origin were visible. I was grateful, of course, but it was a complete mess. I quietly walked down the stairs, avoiding the creaky floorboards as if they were landmines, hoping to sneak out the front door for a breath of fresh air before joining my wife in the kitchen. Unfortunately, Lucy had amazing spatial awareness. One misstep on a creaky floorboard betrayed me, and I felt Lucy's sharp gaze. Her hearing was always incredible. "Oh, look, Dad's awake," Lucy said with a smirk. She had doomed me with just a few words. I heard Lily and Peter dropping their utensils in excitement. "Touché, love," I replied with resignation. I hugged each of them good morning as they rushed towards me and sent them back to the messy breakfast table. Peter was 6 years old. He had bleach blonde hair and a face full of freckles. He was a kind and thoughtful child with many unusual interests like ghosts and mini-golf lately. Lily was 3 years old. She was the complete opposite of Peter, which we initially welcomed. She was outgoing and energetic, showing interest in sports, unlike Peter. The only thing we did not welcome was her health condition. Peter was perfectly healthy, but Lily had a kidney tumor that had to be surgically removed a year ago, along with her kidney. Lucy, as always, looked slender and radiant in the morning light as she washed the dishes. We met when we were 18 and had grown up together. When I remembered to, I let her know she was my kaleidoscope. Looking through her, the bleak world could appear beautiful. It could maybe even have meaning if I looked long enough. After setting the kids at the table, I helped her with the dishes. We talked about work. I had started a new job at Cellsep 2 weeks ago. The hours were tough, but the pay was 3 times what I made at my previous job. Lily's chemotherapy was more important than my sanity. Lucy and I both agreed on this with a mix of a fake and real grin the day I signed my contract. Thankfully, I had been hired along with a colleague, Marjorie. Marjorie was 15 years younger than me, a real genius in cellular biology. It was an honor to work with her, even on days when it made me question my own worth as a scientist. More importantly, though, Lucy and Marjorie were close friends. Lucy and I quietly discussed the job transition, finances, and other topics until she said something that gave me pause. "How are you feeling? Beyond the exhaustion, I mean." I put down the plate I was scrubbing, unsure of what she meant, and gave a vague answer. "I'm okay, hanging in as best I can." She scrunched her nose at my response, a clear sign that she wasn't satisfied with my answer. "Are you sure you're doing okay?" "Yeah, I am," I replied. She looked down. Combined with her scrunched nose, I could tell she was getting frustrated. "John, you just started a new medication and the seizure wasn't that long ago. I know you want to be strong and all that, but..." I turned to her, confused. I had never had a seizure before, and I only took Tylenol occasionally. I wasn't on any medication. "Lucy, what are you talking about?" She kept her head down, not responding. "Lucy," I put a hand on her shoulder. This is where I think the translocation starts. Or maybe it started a few seconds earlier when she asked about the seizure. Suddenly, all the background noise disappeared from our kitchen. I couldn't hear the kids talking, the water running off the dishes, or the birds singing outside the window. When I said Lucy, the word filled the silent space. It was like I shouted in my own ear. Just like that, everything changed. Lucy and the kids were frozen in place like statues. Lucy had her head down at the sink. Lily was sitting up straight, looking out the window with curiosity. Peter was the only one facing me, with both hands on the edge of his chair and his body leaning forward as if he was about to get up from the table. As I moved towards Lucy, I noticed that Peter's eyes followed me. He didn't blink or move any other part of his body, just his eyes tracked me. Then, I noticed something changing in my peripheral vision to the right. The darkness might have suddenly appeared, or it might have slowly crept in while I was focused on the silence and my now motionless family. I turned cautiously, feeling a primal fear of facing the darkness. Where my living room used to be, there was now an empty room lit by a sickly yellow fluorescent light from an unclear source. The tile floor reflected the light, and there were no walls. The tile floor transitioned into inky darkness in every direction. In the middle of the room, a man sat on a bench, watching me. As my vision adjusted to these new dark surroundings, a flood of sounds returned. Every possible sound ever experienced by humanity was present. Laughing, crying, screaming, shouting, machines, music, and nature. It was an overwhelming wave of noise. At the edge of my sanity, the man in the center stood up from the bench. He held both arms out, palms up. His skin was stretched tight on his wrists, with dried blood streaks leading to a point where a fountain of silver liquid erupted. The silver divided into thousands of threads, each with a slightly different angle, all moving upwards into the void that replaced my living room ceiling. With a small motion of bringing his hand slightly forward towards me, the noise stopped instantly. I then began to take in the figure before me. He was at least 10 feet tall. His arms and legs were the same proportions, giving his upper body an unnatural length. His face, however, captured my attention. His skin was a deep red, as if from physical strain, and it was glistening with sweat. He wore a tiny smile, just enough to be recognizable. His unblinking eyes, however, were in stark contrast to the smile. In my life, I have seen extreme physical and mental pain. I have seen the eyes of someone who broke their leg in a hiking accident bulging with agony. I have seen the eyes of a mother whose child was stillborn, filled with sorrow. The pain and emptiness in this figure's eyes surpassed both of those memories. And with those eyes fixed on mine, I found myself somewhere else. My consciousness returned to a hospital bed. A young boy, no older than 14, was holding my hand. I pulled my hand away forcefully. The boy slid back in his chair, startled by my sudden movement. Before I could ask what was happening, Lucy rushed into the room, her work stilettos clacking on the wooden floor. I begged her to get this stranger out of here, to explain what was happening, to give me something concrete to hold on to. With urgency, Lucy said, "Peter, honey, could you go get your uncle from the waiting room and give your father and me a moment?" The hospital's neurologist explained that I had a grand mal seizure at home. She also said that all the tests so far did not show an obvious reason for the seizure, like a tumor or stroke. Though more tests were needed, she reassured us that everything would be fine. We talked about the visions I had experienced, which she attributed to an unusual aura, a sudden sensation that can sometimes precede a seizure. Lucy and I talked for a few minutes while Peter fetched his uncle. As she recounted our lives, home address, current work struggles, etc., I slowly remembered Lily's 8th birthday party, Peter's first day of middle school, and our trip to Bermuda to celebrate my promotion at Celsept. When Peter returned with his uncle, I recognized him as my son. Initially, I was satisfied with the explanation for my visions. Confusion and disorientation after seizures is common, known as a post-ictal state. It gave me hope. That false hope lasted only until my next translocation, prompting me to document my experiences. End of entry 1. John was actually a year off. I was 15 when he had his first seizure. The date is correct, though he was diagnosed with late-onset epilepsy in April 2004, right after my mother's birthday that year. The memory he initially recalled, if real, would have happened in 1995. I apologize, but I am exhausted and need to stop transcribing for now. I will upload again when I can. Peter M. These past few weeks have been really tough, made worse by my own health issues. Despite the setbacks, I am trying to stay strong. I have already made the irreversible decision to share John's deathbed logbook, and I will try to face any consequences with dignity. I think I am beginning to feel regret, but in some way it might already be too late. I might be beyond redemption. I am getting ahead of myself. For now, what's important is to say that I have already read the logbook completely. As you might imagine, understanding the events described was emotionally exhausting. If it didn't matter, I wouldn't bother sharing it with you all. However, my investigation into the logbook has some narrative significance in connecting everything. I hope my commentary will help you see things from my perspective. As a reminder, this image, https:/imgur.com/arb2vbhp, will become increasingly important as we continue. Take a moment with it. The more you understand this symbol, the better you'll understand my motivations and eventually my regrets. Entry 2. Dated August 2004 to March 2005. Second translocation, subsequent events, analysis. Honestly, it reminds me a little bit of the time I did LSD, Greg said quietly, trying and failing to hide his satisfaction. Mum would have sent you to a seminary if she knew you did LSD before you were legally allowed to drink, I replied, rolling my eyes with confidence, a perfected sarcastic response after enduring his satisfaction for nearly 3 decades. We were sitting on the railing of my backyard deck, full from our monthly surf and turf dinner, watching the sun set. As much as I love my brother, his temperament has always been opposite to mine. He is carefree, living life to the fullest, and down to earth. To be honest, I was jealous of his freedom and joyful abandon. Meanwhile, I craved control. For example, I didn't have my first beer until I was 25. I told my childhood friends that it was because I didn't want to jeopardize my future career, which became harder to believe as I got older. In reality, control, or the illusion of it, was like a drug to me. Greg, on the other hand, had fearlessly tried all kinds of substances before graduating high school. LSD, MDMA, THC. He had tried almost every drug, except for PCP. But every move he made, he did with a loving acceptance of reality. He embraced everything. It scared me, man. I mean, where did I get the inspiration for all that? I know it was a hallucination or an aura, but when you have those kinds of things, aren't they based on something, like a movie or a show, or... I was really looking for some reassurance. Well, when I took LSD, I was chased by a creepy guy wearing cashmere and threatening me with scary claws. Greg paused for a moment, thinking. You know, I told that story at a bar 2 years before Nightmare on Elm Street was released. Someone must have overheard and sold my idea to Warner Brothers. I could be living in Beverly Hills right now. Nightmare on Elm Street was released by New Line Cinema, not Warner Brothers. He laughed a little and looked back at the setting sun. He was preparing for his next joke, judging by his concentration. He was always trying to keep the joke going. He was my favorite distraction. I mean, you had your own Freddy, Greg finally said. No claws, though. He's going to get you with his scary wrist strings. I don't think New Line will pay for that idea now. My heart started beating faster, but I didn't know why. After my first translocation, I had a hard time not talking about it constantly. It was almost a compulsion, a pressure building up until I finally gave in and told the whole story. Lucy was a bit tired of it, but her kind nature stopped her from criticizing me too much. Greg wasn't as kind. I just think you need to make light of it. Give it a bit of humor. He paused again, waiting for my response. I kept my gaze away from him and started to distract myself by tracing the shape of a cloud with my eyes. We sat for a moment, my body adjusting to a feeling of calmness. The soft sound of the wind through the grass marked an approaching change. I think its name is Atlas, though. I still refused to look back. Truthfully, I tried to convince myself that this was some new joke, a reference to something I didn't know about, but the sudden silence broke my illusion. I could no longer hear the wind through the grass. That cosmic sound had stopped, replaced by something else. Everything went deathly quiet, signaling a familiar storm. When I looked at Greg, he was still facing forward, his head and shoulders stiff and lifeless. His right eye, despite his body being at a right angle to mine, was focused on me. I couldn't see his left eye, but I imagine it was turned inside his skull, trying to look at me despite the brain tissue and bone in the way. He was frozen, just like the others. As I tried to make sense of this, I felt a primal fear take over. It was as if something terrible was about to happen, something I couldn't control. This feeling of dread grew stronger, and I knew that whatever was coming next would change everything. This recognizable shift terrified me, and I knew it was coming. I didn't know from where, but I knew. Atlas was coming. With a horribly slow and sadistic ease, the right side of Greg's face began to expand. The skin was slowly pulled tight around something trying to push its way out from inside my brother. This cursed transformation was accompanied by the same overwhelming noise as before. Laughs, screams, screeching tires, fireworks, thousands of words spoken at once, all building to an unbearable level. As the shape became clearer, stretching the skin to its limit to reveal the outline of another head, the flesh and tissue tearing audibly among the noise, a single eye broke through Greg's cheek. Atlas! And for a moment, everything stopped. Hypnotized, or maybe in shock, I slowly noticed a scar on the white of the eye itself, thick and burned, running in a semicircle above the iris. But it wasn't just an eye. I couldn't figure out why I knew that. When had I seen this before? Suddenly, my consciousness returned, and I had a split second to see a tree rapidly approaching my field of view. In that tiny moment, I thought of Greg, and in his honor, I accepted the present circumstances. I let go. Only then did I hear the sound of metal crunching and glass shattering, and I was gone again. I woke up in the hospital, this time with too many injuries to list. Driving home from work, I had hit a tree at 60 miles per hour. I was lucky to be alive. With a newly diagnosed seizure disorder, I technically wasn't supposed to be driving. It was believed that a seizure had caused my crash. I agreed, but that didn't tell the whole story. When I got out of the hospital, I asked Greg if he remembered talking about LSD and a nightmare on Elm Street on the porch with me years ago, not expecting much. To my surprise, he did recall something similar. In his version, the conversation started because he was excited that Wes Craven's new Nightmare had just come out on VHS, in other words, late 1995, a few months after the memory in my first translocation. In the following months, bedridden and on stronger anticonvulsants, I had a lot of time to think about what I began to call translocations. I will try to prove their existence, though I'm not hopeful it will make complete sense. Let me start with this. The two translocations I have experienced so far follow a predictable pattern. I am reliving a memory. The ambient noise of the memory fades to complete silence, followed by Atlas appearing with his overwhelming noise. I want to start small by examining one part of that, the sound. What I find fascinating is the initial disappearance of the sound recorded in my memory. Before the noise begins, the ambient sound of the memory is eliminated. It doesn't just continue and add to the noise. Its disappearance seems to signal the arrival of Atlas. But why does it disappear? Why wouldn't it just layer on top of everything else? Why is this important? To explain, think about noise-cancelling headphones, shown in Figure 1, https://imgur.com, IAS6PHGHD. When sound hits noise-cancelling headphones, it is filtered through a microphone, which approximates the wavelength of that sound. Once approximated, the circuitry in the headphone inverts that wavelength. That inverted wavelength is played through the headphone, effectively cancelling the original sound. Think about it this way. Imagine combining a positive number and the same number but negative. You are left with 0. In terms of sound, that is silence. In the figure, My memory is represented by the solid line, and the contribution from Atlas is represented by the dotted line. What does this mean? To me, if we apply the metaphor to my translocations, it means Atlas is acting as the microphone. Some part of Atlas is an opposite, an inverse, of a memory, of my memory. Inevitably, the question that follows is this: what in God's name is the inverse of a memory? End of entry 2. John's car crash couldn't have come at a worse time in my adolescence. I think that was when I felt most disconnected from him. He was always introverted, sure. He was dedicated to his work and his painting since I was born. But he wasn't reclusive until I started middle school. Day by day, he became more disinterested. My mum thought he was depressed. I thought he was disappointed in me and his life. There were moments where I saw John as whole, funny, passionate and caring, but they became less frequent over time. When he had his first seizure and started medication, it seemed to get even worse. But when he had his near-fatal crash, I thought I had lost him, and our disconnect was permanent. But as he slowly recovered, I began to see more of him reappear. Like clouds parting in the night sky, celestial bodies returning with some guiding moonlight. That period of my life was memorable and defining, but ultimately short-lived, like all good things. Now, with that out of the way, we stand on the edge of it all. This entry, for reasons that will become clear, left me deeply unsettled. After reading it, I nearly ran to the trash can in my kitchen. I held the logbook above the open lid, trying to force my hand to let go and just forget. In the end, I couldn't do it. Defeated by something I couldn't understand, I sat down at my kitchen table, staring at the mirror opposite me. Focusing on my left eye, I noticed the distinctive scar forming a crest above my iris. It seemed to match the symbol at the top of this post, and it was something Atlas and I shared, a souvenir from an injury I sustained only a year ago. In that translocation, John saw my eye, or something like it, but in time I would realize that's not what he actually recognized at that moment. Peter M. Never in my life have I experienced such a persistent case of insomnia as I did after reading the details of John's second translocation. My left eye was identical to Atlas's left eye. Both eyes looked strikingly similar to the sigil, which was present but never mentioned in all of John's entries. It felt like all the remaining thoughts and questions about the contents of the deathbed logbook had started to take up physical space. Every time I moved my head on my pillow, I could feel the weight of those thoughts moving around in my skull, like the fluid in a magic 8-ball. Eventually, I gave up on sleep entirely. I decided to go through the events described in John's logbook again, trying to look at each piece from every possible angle to find an insight, as if that insight would act as a kind of sleeping pill. Unfortunately, it became clear that I was still missing some crucial parts of the story, and I couldn't find anything new from the information I already had that would calm my tired mind. I needed more. Cup of coffee in hand, I reluctantly sat back down at my office desk. I glanced at the clock, 3:30 a.m. After taking a few deep, calming breaths, I tried to prepare myself and turned over another menu. For the next several logs I read that night, I don't think it will be useful to reproduce them here in full. First of all, there is some repetition in the entries that might only make the main events harder to follow. More importantly, though, is my fear of not finishing. My health has worsened again since the last time I posted. I am eager to wrap this up, so I will use the space below to summarize those entries to keep things moving at a reasonable pace. Before I begin, I feel like I need to explain how I injured my left eye. Death comes for all of us from the moment we are born. Sometimes slowly, sometimes quickly. If you had asked me a year ago which was preferable, assuming you had to choose, I would say a quick death, without any hesitation. Watching my dad lose his identity step by step over the last 5 years has been indescribably painful. And to clarify, I really do mean indescribable. I genuinely don't know the right words to describe the horrors of dementia. God knows I've tried to find them. It's like watching someone's soul decay. Each passing day, a small part of your loved one is taken away, dissolving into the air like steam. But, unlike with my fiancée, I had plenty of time to say my goodbyes, I suppose. With no creativity, my response to John's disease was to bottle up my emotions and turn to alcohol to dull my senses. A tale as old as time. Wren, my fiancée, tried to help me, but I was regularly drunk, sad and distracted, and when it mattered most, I didn't see the stop sign. Unlike John, I lost her instantly. I, on the other hand, only got a deep cut to my left eye and a few broken ribs. Wren knew I loved her, thankfully. I had made sure to tell her how much she meant to me, calling her my kaleidoscope. Looking through her, the world could appear vibrant and worthwhile, and I made sure she knew that. In another painful twist, John wasn't able to talk me through how he dealt with the guilt of his crash, endangering his life and the lives of others by ignoring the fact that he wasn't supposed to drive with a newly diagnosed seizure disorder. He couldn't tell me how he coped with overwhelming regret. My father was too far gone by the time Wren died. Two dimming stars in the night sky that nearly crossed paths. John and I were following similar paths, but we were just a little too far from each other to communicate. I need to move on from this topic, or I'll never finish this. Just know that after the events of the last year, I don't have such a clear answer for which death is worse. Not anymore. Selected excerpt 1, April 2005. One thing I have noticed upon reflection is that some of my memories in the past few years do not feel entirely my own. I have spent months recovering from my crash, seizure and translocation free, thankfully, which has allowed me the opportunity to review my cache of recollections in full. From at least the year 2000 and on, I feel like I have only the imprints of my memories. They are just files stored on a biological hard drive. I can access them, open and close them, but I do not feel like I myself experienced them. Lucy attributes this all to the stress of my position at CellSept, with a resulting depression draining those more recent memories of their inherent technicolor. I have considered this, but I'm not so sure. Although I have taken the time to confirm these abnormally textured memories are not false, i.e., confirmed with others that they did actually happen, as I can recollect them. I just do not feel I was there when they were made, but I clearly was. An important insight. I will come back to it soon. Most of the entries before and after the crash are very introspective and well written. After explaining his theory about why sound disappears with the arrival of Atlas in his translocations and how that could represent the inverse of a memory, see the end of post 2, he continues to try to prove the existence and scientific basis of his translocations. To save you the trouble, I have left out most of the entries dedicated to mathematically proving his translocations. Personally, I struggled with the noise-cancelling headphones metaphor for a while before I felt like I understood it. Little did I know that this was just the beginning compared to his later theories. If you have a PhD in calculus, biophysics, and electromagnetism, feel free to message me privately and I'll send over some pictures. For us laypeople, it's best to skip ahead to this next part. Selected excerpt 2, July 2005. And the biophysical motion as calculated does seem mathematically sound. However, to complete my postulates, I will need to perform an experiment in spatial relativity. To do this, I will need to adopt a sort of metaphysical vigilance. At some point, I expect I will begin translocating again. When I do, I will need to somehow recognize that my consciousness is out of its expected position before Atlas makes its presence known. To this end, and to Lucy's annoyance, relating to a lack of spousal consultation, I went out and got my first tattoo this morning. Specifically, one of the Smashing Pumpkins logos, the heart that has the letters SP within it. It covers most of my right forearm and currently stings like fresh hell. My reasoning is this. If my mind is going back into a memory, I think I should remember what was, not what is. So, if I'm in the middle of a translocation, lost in a memory, I will not have this tattoo on my forearm. Hopefully, this will help me realize I'm translocating before Atlas finds me. There are some issues with this plan. First, it is possible that my current self and my past self will merge in the memory, and I might see the tattoo on my arm even though it wasn't there yet. Our memories are very unreliable and can be influenced by external factors. Second, if in the future I translocate to a memory that happens after I got my tattoo, this will not help. Lastly, even if it works, I don't know if I will be able to see the evidence I'm looking for. If it works, and I can realize I'm translocating before Atlas arrives, I hope I can find my anchor. There are no entries dated between July 2005 and the end of 2007. In early 2008, the entries resumed, but they just start over with describing his initial translocation with some notable differences. The first noticeable difference is the date. The second and more disturbing difference is how they quickly become fragmented and chaotic. Excerpt from March 2008. First translocation. The morning of the first translocation was like any other. I woke up around 9 a.m. Lucy was already out of bed and probably had been for some time. Peter and Lily had really become a handful over the last few years, and Lucy needed help giving Lily her medications. Weary, I stood at the top of our staircase, looking at the beautiful chaos of raising young children. Immediate, harsh scribbles directly after the word children. John put NLRP 77 in SC 484. 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 More scribbles. I then began to see the figure before me. He stood at least 10 feet tall. His arms and legs were the same length, which made his upper body look unnaturally long, 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 which made his upper body look unnaturally long. His skin was tight and stretched and tight and stretched and tight and stretched on both of his wrists, tired flesh rising about a foot symmetrically above each hand. Dried blood streaks led to a center point of the stretched skin, where a fountain of silvery liquid erupted upwards. Following the silver with my eyes, 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 following the silver with my eyes. It goes on like that for a while, then cuts off into more scribbles. The scribbles were mixed with sketches of the sigil, see here for reference. There are many entries like this, with the only new phrase being, John put NLRP 77 in SC 484. None of those numbers meant anything to me when I first read them. When I looked up from my desk, dawn had arrived. With about 10 entries left, I decided to stop. I had responsibilities to attend to, involving Lucy, my mother. I knew I had to ask her about the deathbed logbook, but I dreaded it deeply, not because I was afraid of her reaction or emotional state after reading it, or because I thought she wouldn't know anything. It was the opposite. I was afraid of what she might know. I dragged my sleep-deprived body over to the house I grew up in. After John's passing, my mom had planned to declutter and downsize their belongings, intending to move in with Greg and his family. She answered the door with her usual cheerful demeanor, but her mood shifted to concern when she saw my bloodshot eyes. I think John fell in love with my mother for the same reasons he was jealous of Greg. Lucy took life in stride, and this made her incredibly resilient to change and hardship. Despite this, my father's dementia had undeniably drained some of her brightness. You could tell that her cheerful demeanor was slightly hollow nowadays. That being said, Lucy's ability to still maintain that demeanor, even if slightly hollow, is perhaps the greatest testament to her resilience. After helping her with various tasks that morning, we sat down at the kitchen table for lunch, and I finally found the courage to show her some of the logs. I only brought parts for her to review, not wanting to upset her with the more violent imagery. John never mentioned anything about a 10-foot-tall man visiting him in his memories, she remarked with a characteristic laugh. Credit where it's due, the abruptness and absurdity of that question is objectively funny, and it was comforting to know that Lucy could still find humor in these dark days. Honestly, honey, I think it's all just remnants of his mind having a last hurrah, she said after reading. I know this has hurt you deeply, especially since you were busy with your residency training the last few years. You have enough on your plate with what happened to Ren. Try not to overburden yourself. You don't think it's odd that Dad was able to write this in secret while on hospice, with us needing to help him with everything like we did? Lucy took a moment to consider that. Eventually she replied, I think Dad spent his last few years in a power struggle with his dementia, whether he knew it or not. I know you weren't around to see this, but some days were great. He was almost himself. She paused and rephrased. Well, no, that's not quite right. He was always himself, to his last moments here. On his good days, though, he could act like himself. This would include writing, as you know. You never saw him writing anything while visiting him at hospice? I asked sharply, trying to swallow the sorrow building in my throat. I needed to stay focused. Lucy put her hand over mine. No, Pete, nothing, but that doesn't mean he couldn't or didn't. Also, You know how overworked the aides are in the memory unit? Just because they didn't see or don't remember seeing him right doesn't mean it didn't happen. We were silent for a while after that, calming down from the emotional exchange. It reminds me a lot of the way he would write his research, actually. I wish we could ask Marjorie, she said sadly. This is the turning point. Wait, that's a great idea. Why can't we ask her? Marjorie, as a reminder, was Dad's co-researcher at Cell Sept. They met in graduate school and became fast friends, despite the 15-year age gap. As you might imagine, there weren't many options for academic kinship when my dad was earning his PhD. Cellular topography is a niche field now, let alone in the 80s. See post 1 for a more complete description of the job. Lucy and Marjorie also got along very well, but I suddenly realized I hadn't seen them together since I graduated middle school. When Lucy saw my confused expression, she covered her mouth, realizing she had let something slip. Well, shoot. We didn't want to tell you when you were a kid, love. It was right after Dad's crash. You were still very shaken up about death and dying. It took me a moment to understand what she was implying. Marjorie is dead. Lucy then filled in some critical gaps in the story. After John's crash, Marjorie took over as the sole researcher on the project they had both recently been promoted to. Cell Sept was a pharmaceutical company focused on developing medications to improve human longevity at the cellular level. They had been working there since grad school, at least a decade, without a significant pay increase before this new project. The goal was this. Another branch of the company had found a line of uniquely immortal stem cells, and it became John and Marjorie's job to determine on a cellular level why that was the case. Lucy thinks these cells were discovered incidentally during an autopsy of someone who had donated their body to science, but that's all she can remember of their origin. My mum thinks the promotion happened in early 2004, a few months before the first entry in John's logbook. After the crash incapacitated John, Marjorie's workload doubled as she mapped the interior of those infinitely dividing cells without a partner. In the chaos of the crash and caring for John's extensive health needs after his release from the hospital, Lucy had lost touch with Marjorie. She explained to me that she assumed Marjorie was consumed with work, now that she was the only one on the project, and that's why she saw little of her in those months after the accident. There was a time while my dad recovered when he considered not returning to Cell Sept. According to Lucy, he felt more alive during that recovery time than he had since he took the job. John thought maybe he would become a stay-at-home dad. Lily, my sister, still had health issues after her childhood cancer that would always benefit from more supervision. One night in May 2004, however, John received an unexpected call from Marjorie's wife. Over the previous few months, Marjorie had developed rapid onset neurological symptoms and was unlikely to live for more than another week. Doctors had diagnosed her with sporadic CJD, also known as Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. CJD is a rapidly progressive and incredibly rare disease, estimated to affect about 1 American in a million per year. Essentially, the disease involves prions, self-propagating proteins that cause damage and degradation of neurons in the brain. This disease remains poorly understood because it's the only disease where proteins alone act as an infection. Proteins are the molecules that allow all cells to function. They are fundamental building blocks for human cells, bacterial cells, viral cells, and so on. However, they are not really considered to be alive. They are just parts that create a larger whole. In the same way, if you cut off your hand and somehow kept the tissue from decaying, you probably wouldn't consider that hand to be alive in the same way you are. And yet, the proteins involved in CJD can infect a human host if infected tissues are consumed, an ability thought to be reserved for living things. There are cases in Papua New Guinea of tribespeople developing a subset of this disease due to ritualistic cannibalism of human brain tissue. There is no treatment, and the disease is usually diagnosed based on symptoms and supported by MRI and lab findings. However, the only way to definitively diagnose the disease is through a brain biopsy, which is rarely done due to the risk of spreading the infectious, deadly protein. Most patients die within a year of symptom onset. The key point is that the symptoms of CJD are, broadly speaking, the same as Alzheimer's dementia, John's diagnosis. They just occur and progress much faster. When I asked Lucy if Marjorie had any seizures, she said she did. I later researched CJD extensively and found that seizures are incredibly uncommon in CJD. a disease that is already a 1 in a million diagnosis. The National Institutes of Health states that less than 3% of CJD cases are accompanied by seizures. Marjorie died 2 days after my dad got that phone call. No brain biopsy was ever done. Because CellCept wanted the project to continue, they threatened John's severance package and reputation in the field if he didn't return to work. Under that pressure, he returned to CellCept in September 2005. These revelations staggered me. I could tell with a strange intuition that all of this was relevant, but I didn't initially know why. It seemed that John experienced all the same symptoms as Marjorie, but she succumbed to her disease much faster. Yet something was wrong here. John certainly didn't develop CJD. He wouldn't have lasted so long with that diagnosis. On the other hand, Marjorie developed all the same symptoms as John, including seizures, which don't fit with the diagnosis of CJD, or are at least an extremely rare manifestation of an already extremely rare disease. Knowing that understanding this new information would take time, I set it aside and resumed helping Lucy pack. While doing so, I ended up taking apart the bed frame in John's old room. I say John's room because they had been sleeping in different bedrooms for at least a decade before his death. This was not a sign of a failing marriage. John was a very light sleeper, and Lucy was diagnosed with sleep apnea in 2001, which required her to wear a CPAP machine overnight. If you're not familiar with how CPAP machines looked in the early 2000s, it's worth a look. They were loud, heavy machines back then. John would have had better luck sleeping in the same room as a practicing mariachi band. As if the past 24 hours hadn't been dizzying enough, while dismantling the wooden bed frame, I discovered something hidden in the exact same part of the bed where I had found his logbook. In his hospice room, I found the logs under the mattress in the top left-hand corner. In his old bedroom, I found a single key taped to the underside of the frame in the same top left-hand corner. Engraved on the key were the numbers 484. As much as I want to finish this, I need to rest. To introduce what is coming in the next post, which may be the second to last or final post, depending on my energy levels in the coming days, the SC484 in the phrase John put NLRP77 in SC484 referred to a storage container numbered 484 at a warehouse half an hour from my childhood home. When questioned, Lucy didn't know of its existence. No one did. Days later, I found the courage to find and unlock that terrible vault. Inside an 800-square-foot container were thousands of moth-eaten marble notebooks stacked in disorganized, chaotic piles, as well as the final grim piece to understanding the sigil. John was right when he said the sigil wasn't depicting an eye, or more accurately, it wasn't just the depiction of an eye. Something more devastating was hidden within it. Peter M. As the door to the storage unit swung open, I was immediately hit by the smell of mold and decay. The heavy, damp odor stuck to my nostrils as I blindly felt around the room, searching for a light switch. After nearly tripping several times, my hand finally found a cold metal chain, and I pulled it. With a faint click, the entire room was instantly illuminated. Countless marble notebooks were stacked in uneven, messy piles, almost filling the entire space. From a distance, it looked like a crowded cityscape, now bathed in light. At this point, all my caution and hesitation had melted away. I grabbed the nearest marble notebook and flipped through it wildly until I found a page with blue ink. I read the first line and caught my breath. I stood there for who knows how long, reading that first line over and over, hoping it would change. Eventually, my mind began to overheat and malfunction. I threw the notebook with such force that I heard its spine snap when it hit the rusty walls of the storage container. I grabbed a second notebook and threw it even harder after reading the first line, then a third, a fourth, a fifth, and more, until I had thrown about 30 notebooks, consumed by frenzy. When my legs finally gave out, I collapsed to the floor and sobbed for the first time in weeks. The first line read, "The morning of the first translocation was like any other. I woke up around 9 a.m. Lucy was already out of bed and probably had been for some time. Peter and Lily had really become a handful over the last few years, and Lucy needed help giving Lily her medications. I didn't check the contents of all the notebooks. It didn't seem necessary after the 30th one. Every single journal contained the same writings. identical to the copy I found at John's hospice. It was like finding one sibling reunited with thousands of identical twins hidden away for years in this warehouse. In the remaining space between the stacks of notebooks were thousands more crude sketches of the sigil. The drawings were rushed but precise, all very recognizable as copies of one another. There was one more discovery. In the very back of the room, in the oldest, most ancient part of this place, there was a small brown box. The words and symbols on the cardboard were worn but readable. Cellcept records, biomodeling department, do not remove. In my car, parked outside the old storage warehouse, I finished reading the last of John's deathbed logbook and the contents of Cellcept's stolen records. I sat there for hours, motionless in the driver's seat, thinking about the meaning of it all and how it would guide my next actions. When I finally started to come out of my trance, I found myself looking up at the night sky, even though it had been mid-morning when I arrived at the warehouse. I then gently rested my forehead against the steering wheel, reflecting silently on the night sky and its symbolism. I thought of John, a guiding constellation, a series of dim lights impossibly far away but still pulling me forward. Instead of driving home, I called an Uber. It was probably an unnecessary precaution, but I didn't need my car anymore anyway. As far as I know, it's still there. When I got home to my empty apartment, I began typing the first post. These final passages are the hardest to write. There's a lot to unpack in John's translocation theories. I'll try to simplify it in a way that makes sense. In truth, though, I don't really need to. I think I've already accomplished what I set out to do. But, in honor of him, I will try. Unlabeled entry. Dated March 2009. I don't want to disappoint you, but I still think Songs for the Deaf is better, I said, knowing exactly how to get a reaction from Pete. Like a match to gasoline-soaked kindling, my son burst into a passionate argument defending Era Vulgaris as Queens of the Stone Age's best record. If I'm being honest, I don't know which one I prefer, but I knew I had bought myself some time to attend to a few things while Pete was busy proving, mathematically and beyond a doubt, that I was too old to appreciate the new record. I massaged the part of my thigh I could reach inside my cast, took a few Advil, and answered work emails on our family's desktop computer. All the while, I got to listen to my son's passion for something that clearly meant a lot to him, which, truthfully, was probably better than listening to either of those albums. This had become our nightly ritual since my crash. He would play a song I had never heard, then I'd give him my impression. Then I would play a song he had never heard, and he'd give me his impression, and so on, forever. I've come to appreciate Billy Talent's energetic guitar work, and he's come to enjoy older bands like Television and T-Rex. And it turns out, no matter how hard we try, we both don't like Tool. In the past, I never came home with the energy for much after spending 10 hours doing research. All this was going to have to be put on hold for a while, though. I would be returning to work in 3 weeks. The emails Cellcept forwarded to me included some of Marjorie's preliminary research on NLRP-77. God rest her soul. I stared blankly at the screen, dreading the thought of returning to work. In the end, it turned out I just wanted more of this. More time with Lucy. More time with my kids. The crash had put everything into perspective. Oye, Major Tom to ground control. Are you going to play your next one or what? Pete's terrible and possibly offensive Cockney British accent brought me back to reality. His detailed presentation on Era Vulgaris's artistic dominance had apparently ended, but I had been too distracted to notice. Yeah, Ziggy, hold your horses. I slid my rolling chair over to our CD sound system and flipped through my collection. Ah, now we're cooking. Melancholy and the Infinite Sadness, track 2 of disc 2, Bodies. It may be the second track on the second disc, but it's number 1 with a bullet with butterfly wings. I waited in anticipation for my son's inevitable groan at what was arguably a passable Smashing Pumpkins joke, but I heard nothing. Despite inserting the disc and finding the track, the music wasn't playing either. I pushed the play button a few times with my right index finger, then I had the urge to pause and look at my forearm. Blank, unadorned skin, except for hair and a few small freckles. No tattoo. Then it hit me. I knew I didn't have much time. Turning around to face my son, I found him standing a few feet from me, eyes fixed and glazed over but following my movements. I quickly began scanning my entire body for the tether. Both feet, both ankles, both legs. So far, nothing. Before I could continue, the sight of my son's blood stopped me. As if an invisible scalpel was being drawn over the white of his left eye, a semi-lunar laceration began to form over the top of his iris. stopping at about the 3 o'clock position. Crimson dew began to silently trickle steadily out from the wound, but in utter defiance of the natural order, it trickled upwards to his forehead rather than towards the ground. When it reached his hairline, the blood continued its defiant pilgrimage by elevating in swift motion to the ceiling above my son's head. It pooled and spread circumferentially on the wood paneling. Greedy paralysis overtook me. What was first a trickle then became a stream, then a biblical flood, an impossible amount of blood spilling upwards onto my ceiling. By the looks of it, my son should have been completely exsanguinated 3 times over, but still had more to give. Suddenly, I broke free of my catatonia. The bleeding slowed, and the blood that had congealed on the ceiling began to darken. The silence, uncanny and grim, would not last. I knew what was next. I examined my wrists, my chest, felt my shoulder blades with both hands. Nothing. Right on cue, the room exploded with that familiar cacophony. Car alarms and jackhammers and torrential rain, laughing, screaming, singing, people weeping for both births and deaths. A lifetime of noise condensed, packaged, and then released into a space without the design to house even an atom-sized fragment of it. Then, a figure, Atlas, began to sink from the blackness towards my son, almost angelic in its descent. As wrists appeared from the inky gateway, so did innumerable silver threads. The break in the skin that these threads escaped from, which could not have been larger than an inch, was dusky purple and black from the unwilling rupture of nearby capillaries. All of the silver fibers were pulled impossibly tight, no doubt owing to a connection to something equally impossibly far away. All those fibers, save one singular tether, lay limp out of the metallic bouquet that came from the figure's left wrist. As more of it appeared, I watched it arc upwards until it formed a curled plateau, which eventually began to turn downwards. I was able to trace it to where it ultimately lay on my living room floor, next to my foot, and up the small of my back. I pinched it between my thumb and index finger, almost too thin to appreciate, and let it guide me to its inevitable zenith at the point where my spine met the base of my skull. I could not trace it any further, as it appeared to plunge into my skin, my broken tether. When my consciousness returned, I saw Lucy standing above me. She was impatiently detailing my seizure disorder, along with my current spasms, to the 911 dispatcher over her phone. When she saw me looking at her, she dropped her phone and knelt to my side. I was right. Entry. Titled, An Attempt to Describe the Biophysics Surrounding the Translocation of Human Consciousness. Dated as April 2009. Bear with me, this is not easy, but it is vital to everything. Let's start the discussion with a question. How do we manage to all stay in the same time? How are you in 4:36 p.m. on April 15th, 2009? The same time I am, the same time your friend is, the same time the whole world is. Then, perhaps more importantly, how do we all move together, the entire world in lockstep, to 4:37 p.m.? How do we somehow, with no will or forethought, keep the entire world's cosmic watch in synchrony? Do we make the conscious decision to do so? No, of course we don't. But what are the implications of that? As a way of understanding this, imagine your consciousness as a dog and time as a leash. When we're all in 4:36 p.m. on April 15th, 2009, we are leashed there and are unable to move from that time. You cannot will yourself into inhabiting the day before, nor can you will yourself to inhabiting a week from now. You are stuck where you are, a dog on a leash. That is, until the thing holding the leash moves you forward. Essentially, the point is, for this all to work as we know it does, not only do we all have to be anchored together at one singular time, to remain in synchrony, we also all have to be moved together as a unit to the following point in time as well. Next, consider your position in physical space, where you are in the world at any one moment. That is something we do have control and agency over. If we want to go to the grocery store, we make the effort to find our way there. But we do have to put in the effort, the energy, to move there, don't we? Why is time, another coordinate that describes our placement in the universe, just like our physical location, any different? If movement takes energy, whether that be in a time or in space, something has to exert that energy to make it happen. But if not us, then who? Ultimately, humanity has not really needed to confront this mystery. It has always been a given, a natural law. We all occupy the same point in time, whether we like it or not. And if we are not in control of it, and it keeps moving without our input, Why bother questioning it? But what if that system began to break somehow? What if somehow one's consciousness fell out of line, became desynchronized from the rest of us, became very specifically untethered? I believe my translocations are what happens when that leash becomes damaged. Let's continue with this line of thought. As much as I despise mixing metaphors, I want to instead imagine our consciousness as someone tubing through river rapids against a strong current. In this example, the body of water is time, which you are moved through by being tethered via a rope to a boat with an engine in front of you. If that tether were to be damaged or even break, you're not going to just stop in place. You are going to find yourself moving backwards down the river. The boat isn't necessarily going to stop moving forward either. That is, until the person driving the boat notices you're gone. That person driving the boat, moving us all through time, is Atlas. There is one final hurdle to cross before I can start to put this all together, and it's the one that I have struggled with the most. I wrote before about our bodies and how they occupy a physical space in the world, but time, as it would seem, is another plane of reality entirely. I think our consciousnesses, or souls if you're more religiously inclined, occupy that plane of reality, not our bodies, as it stands to reason that we need some part of ourselves in that dimension. Otherwise, how could we be pulled through it? Now, with all the pieces in place, let's run a thought experiment. Let's theorize somehow that I become untethered from Atlas. With nothing pulling me forward and the river's current inherently being in the opposite direction, my consciousness begins to move backward down that river, and I find myself experiencing my own memories as if it were the first time. In my translocations, I have always found myself in a past memory, only to be dragged forward to what appears to be the present. This would explain why I have the impression that there are some memories that I can recount, but do not feel like I personally experienced. If I become untethered, I theorize my body may keep moving forward, like it is on autopilot, despite my consciousness moving in the opposite direction. To the people around me, it would probably appear like I was not feeling myself or depressed, almost like the expression, "The lights are on, but no one is home." My consciousness is somewhere else. My flesh keeps moving. Then, when Atlas brings me back and I am reconnected with my body, my neurons still have stored memories of the events my consciousness missed. Continuing on, this could also explain a lot of the characteristics of my encounters with Atlas. It is tethered to every living person in existence, bearing witness to the entirety of humanity's consciousness in unison. If Atlas realized I was missing and went downriver to find and re-tether me, when I started to perceive Atlas, I theorize I might start to become attuned to what it experiences, moment to moment. Maybe that is why the sound in my memories goes silent as a harbinger of its approach, the so-called inverse of a memory I previously described. In a sense, Atlas experiences everything, but never directly, omnipresent but imperceptible, within but without. So it has lived those same memories before as well, just from another side of it. But if Atlas goes downriver to find me, what happens to everyone else? Somehow, I think they just remain where they are. In my translocations, Atlas always has thousands of metallic threads erupting from his wrists into darkness. I believe these are all of humanity's tethers. It would stand to reason that if everyone else remains upriver where they are, but are still connected to Atlas as it proceeds downriver to find me, that those connections would become tighter, more strained, pulling and damaging him in the process. As described in some of my translocations, its face always appears red and strained, as if it is greatly exerting itself in the process of finding and returning my consciousness to the present, while holding everyone else's consciousness in stasis. As for what everyone else experiences when Atlas goes looking for me, I suspect nothing. If it is the one that moves time forward, and has the ability to lock everyone else in a single moment, it would essentially be like time stopped for those remaining in the present, only to resume when Atlas returned with my consciousness, see figure 29. I feel fairly confident in all this, not only because of the calculations I have previously noted, but also because I was able to find my loose tether before I was returned to the present in my most recent translocation. I had deduced that I wasn't completely disconnected from Atlas, because it has been able to find me. Rather, my tether is damaged but still somewhat attached. Maybe loose is a better word. And what of the seizures? Well, in describing Atlas and its function, I don't think it should be surprising that I would describe it as a god, or the closest thing humanity has to one. Atlas pulling my consciousness through decades of time to the present is likely beyond what our consciousness was built to endure. When Atlas brings my consciousness back, and it reconnects with my body, I imagine it has built up some kind of velocity in its trip upriver, only to stop abruptly when the present is reached, causing neuronal damage, like a whiplash injury for the cells in your brain. Think about the potential damage wrought by going 100 miles an hour in a race car and then slamming on the brakes. That excess kinetic force somehow overloads the brain's wiring, resulting in a seizure. To me, that leaves one final question: what severed my connection in the first place? In cellular topography and science in general, you are taught to try to examine things from every angle. Ever since I saw Atlas and his scarred left eye, I have felt a compulsion to draw it over and over and over again. I felt the need to reproduce it. At some point it dawned on me, what if I took that sketch, the one that had so consumed me, and imagined looking at it from another angle? If I turned it, rotated it in three-dimensional space, would it not look like Atlas, its tethers, and me falling behind? Figure 30. The results of this epiphany were twofold. One, it was the first domino that helped me develop my theory about Atlas and the tethers. More importantly, however, it broke some hold over me, some obscuring veil. I knew I had seen this shape, this sigil before. I had seen it more than any other person currently living, I think, but it benefited from me not knowing that. Once I made the connection, I realized I must quarantine this sigil and these notes at the cost of everything. I can take the rest from here. I want to use this moment to apologize for the deception in my intent, the sleight of hand. I know I have committed a cardinal sin. At this point, I don't expect forgiveness. In that box that John stole from Cellcept, I found NLRP77. It was a protein unique to that immortal stem cell line that John and Marjorie had been tasked with deconstructing. As far as I can tell, NLRP77 had never been viewed by human eyes before they were asked to research it. Discarding the more cryptic and unintelligible data logs, I found and uploaded this summary sheet, which I think provides an adequate explanation. As a start, John and Marjorie never used NLRP77 to develop any sort of pharmaceutical. They had barely finished cataloguing the protein structure when their symptoms began to take root. Evidently, they also presented their preliminary findings at a Board of Trustees meeting. 3 out of 8 of those board members in attendance would end up developing dementia-like symptoms, just from brief encounters with the visage of NLRP77. To finally come out and say it, it seems that simply viewing NLRP77's biochemical structure, i.e. the sigil, is likely to blame for John and Marjorie's deaths. Let me follow in John's footsteps with a few of my own theories. I don't think the translocations, the movement of John's consciousness, did any real damage to his physical body. I mean, he lost nearly everything that made him himself in the present, but his residual faculties allowed him to keep trudging through life. To me, he felt soulless, a notion John entertains during his theories as well. But Atlas transporting their consciousness back to their bodies, putting them through something they were never meant to be subjected to, I think that eventually killed them. I also think that caused their dementia-like symptoms before they died. Or maybe dementia-like is incorrect. Maybe this is the true pathology behind dementia, and all dementia is just a representation of untethering for one reason or another. Maybe the sigil is like prions, the infectious proteins that cause CJD. There was a point in medical history when we thought prions could never act like an infection, because they were not actually considered to be alive. And yet, here was an example of an insignia itself acting as the infection. I mean, John goes out of his way to nearly say as much. He needed to quarantine the sigil. He certainly felt a compulsion to reproduce the image. He just found a way to channel it and store it away. The sigil also seems to go out its way to protect its reproduction too. He didn't realize that the shape of Atlas's eye that he felt so compelled to draw and the biochemical shape of NLRP77 were one and the same until years after he began his research on the protein, as to why he was able to last so much longer than Marjorie. Maybe he didn't die as quickly because he inadvertently detoxified himself by replicating his logbook and that sigil thousands of times, physically exuding the image from his body. Or maybe his genetics were just better able to handle the whiplash of his consciousness returning to the present. I don't think we'll ever really know. He was almost successful in quarantining it too. It seems at the last second, however, the sigil won out, because I discovered his deathbed logbook. Some part of him clearly tried to fight it. He even hid the forbidden transcripts under his mattress in the part of the bed where his key to the storage unit would have been at home. He knew where the logbook needed to go, just didn't have the ability to get it there. In the end, I found it. But maybe it is something more than just an infection. I mean, what about Atlas? Sure does seem like a god to me. Could NLRP77 just represent a divine threshold that we were designed not to cross? a symbol deviously manufactured so that, when we had the technology to find and view it, when we were on the cusp of ascending too high for our own good, would act as a self-propagating, neurological self-destruct button. What's more, if this is just a biologic phenomenon, how did I end up with the sigil on my eye as well, a year before I would learn anything about NLRP-77? Is that not evidence that I was fated to disseminate the sigil? Was I not marked with divine purpose? Which brings me back to my apology. As you might have gathered by now, the goal of posting all this was not exactly to memorialize John, although that was certainly a bonus for me. His narrative, in actuality, was a delivery system that I suspected would better reproduce the sigil within you. You may find yourself asking why I didn't just post the image over and over again on every corner of the internet. I don't think that's enough, or at least it's a smaller dose than what I need to administer to achieve my intent. Take the board meeting at Celcept. Only 3 out of 8 of the board members were seemingly infected, but they all viewed the protein the same number of times. Maybe the 3 that were infected found themselves more intrigued by NLRP-77 than their fellow board members at that presentation. Maybe they lost sleep over the possibilities of what it could really mean for all of us. Maybe they found themselves rolling the image around in their head, blissfully unaware that they were catalyzing their own untethering. NLRP-77, to my understanding, is not just biology, nor is just divinity. It's something more. It's the common endpoint where intellectualism and faith meet and become inseparable from each other, and John finally found it. A monkey's paw for sure, but he found it. Or, alternatively, I've fallen victim to grief-induced psychosis. Certainly not impossible, especially in the context that I believe I translocated for the first time the night after I visited my childhood home and found the storage unit key. I believe Atlas delivered my consciousness back to my body a few days later, as I woke up on the floor of my apartment with new bruises and a concussion. In the time that my consciousness was moving backwards on that river, I found myself translocating to the exact same memory John mentions in his last entry, the one of us sharing music. The return to reality after briefly imbibing in that memory crushed any last living piece of me in its entirety. I killed Ren. I lost John. There is truly nothing left for me here. If I was uncertain about spreading the sigil, that uncertainty left me when I finished his logs and discovered he translocated to the same memory. 2 dying stars once again crossing paths with each other for a fleeting moment in the night sky. In untethering some of you as a result of reading this, I hope to completely overwhelm Atlas to the point that he begins to fail in his godly duties, or at least slow him down from finding me on the river. John says it himself in his logs. Atlas always appears to be strained and overexerted when it materializes. Maybe there is some god that designed Atlas too. Maybe that god didn't anticipate the amount of life that could bloom as a result of their ambition, and Atlas is simply buckling under the pressure. My theory is that the more people I untether, the less likely Atlas is to find me, allowing me to bury myself in a time far away from here. Or, if NLRP-77 is a deadly infection caused by some visually transmissible prokaryote, or the carefully crafted machinations of a vengeful eldritch god, the promise of velvety sleep in a time far better than this would be an exceptionally coercive thing to whisper in my ear. Effective motivation for helping manifest an apocalypse. I miss you, Dad. See you soon.